Hello, I'm John Brink and we are podcasting on the Brink from downtown Prince George, British Columbia, and it is a smoky Prince George. It's in the middle of BC. BC, for those international guests watching us, it's a big, big province, and this probably right now in the middle of the summer is probably one of the worst seasons for fires all around us. Throughout the province, so it's not very good for the actual forest. Our program today is BC Forest Industry in Transition, and today our guest is Liam Parfitt. Liam, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you've been in Prince George for quite a while, I believe.
I first came here in 1996 tree planting when I was 16 years old.
When you was 1996, you were a young fella then, and then you kind of got the taste for the forest industry, and now you are a logger.
Yeah, I suppose you could say I'm a logger. Freya Logging is a bit more an idea than a logging company, and the idea is that we're not getting a lot of value out of our forests.
Okay.
So we want to add some value to our forests. It's not just about wood production, and it's not just about protecting the forest. It's about active management for the things that we want out of our forest. And today, something I want is clean air. When you have a whole lot of conifer around that's really dense and thick, you're going to have a lot of fires. And throw a little bit of climate change into that, and it's going to get worse. So.
Right. So Freya, what does it stand for?
It stands for Everybody's Working for the Weekend. So Friday is Freya's Day, and Freya is one of the Norse or Saxon gods. There was Odin, which is Wednesday, Thor, which is Thursday, Tyr, which is Tuesday, and Freya, which is Friday. So Friday's a fun day. Everybody likes Friday, and she also happens to be the goddess of fertility and war. So, you know, most men like those things. So.
Interesting. So that is what it is.
Well, it's also a Scandinavian god, basically, and we're a Scandinavian inspired company. My wife is a Laplander from Lapland, northern Sweden. Okay. And the idea of Freya came, my son was born in Sweden in 2004. Okay. And I saw very good forest management in Sweden. Right. And I was at UNBC Forestry here, and I didn't particularly think that we were taking what the RPFs, which is a registered professional forester, would write a prescription how they wanted the forest to look. Right. And we would go out there, but they would write whatever they wanted on the piece of paper, and the guy in the feather buncher would do whatever he wanted, and the desire and the goal wasn't attached to each other particularly. So. Right. Yeah.
So, so you went to UNBC, the forest program, forest
Bachelor of Science in Forestry.
Bachelor of, which makes you then an RPF, or is that a master?
We can actually put a good segue in here. I started down the RPF program, and I decided that I didn't want anything to do with being an RPF. Okay. Because I felt like they
registered professional forester.
Registered professional forester. Yeah. You get a Bachelor of Science, and then you do some forestry and training for a couple of years, and then you write a test, and then they give you your ring and your seal. Well, actually, you get a ring when you finish school, but you get your seal, and you can stamp things. But it's very, for somebody who's maybe a bit like yourself, I like to make things happen. Right. RPFs are a lot about talking about sustainable forest management. Yeah. It doesn't actually happen. And when you are an RPF, it kind of, I would never want to sign off on my own prescription. Right. Because there could be a conflict of interest. Correct. But I do my own prescriptions all the time, but I get an RPF to verify that. Kind of like you'd hire a lawyer to finish a business deal. Yeah. Because you wouldn't necessarily want to represent yourself in court, I guess. Okay. So, but I think that I started on that road, and I realized that what was holding us back in British Columbia particularly, it wasn't the desire to do good forestry from the RPF Association. It wasn't that UNBC is a wonderful university. It was technology, and we weren't using the right technology in the bush. And I wanted to understand why we weren't using that technology. So I went into equipment sales, because equipment sales forms the basis of how we do forestry in the province. And I don't know, I'm just going to have a little historical segue. Genghis Khan had the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. And he did it because he had a horse archer that could shoot 20 meters further than anybody else. So we just ride around other guys and shoot them until they all died is kind of like having a rifle versus a musket.
Right.
So technology often drives changes much more than our desire to drive change.
Right.
So, I mean, we have this elevated carbon dioxide, not because anybody wanted elevated carbon dioxide, it's because we designed diesel engines and coal-fired power.
Right.
So the technology often gives you things, it's a Pandora's box. And so one of the things I saw was our logging equipment was giving us different forests than what they were getting in Sweden with different logging equipment.
Right. So just trying to still quite get it in handle on, so what does your company do then? Are you active in, you're not a logger, meaning...
I'm a logger, yeah.
Are you harvesting
yes.
timber for companies?
Yeah.
And then you hire, you have equipment or hire equipment and individuals to do logging for either tenured company that have tenure, or other ones that have a license that gives them the right to log a certain portion, and they hire you to do that. So that is the makeup, just for our guests listening, is that since this program is BC Forest Industry in Transition, the program in particular deals with issues around the forest industry, and in particular what is different now from what it was before. Where will it go, or where should it go? And people that are directly involved, like you are, or people that I interview for the purpose of this program. So that then being said, again, for the benefit of our international listeners, or the ones that are not overly familiar with it, BC is somewhat unique. We have an amazing forest.
Absolutely.
Part of it is coastal, distinctly different from the interior. Normally we have about 60 million cubic meters annually that we log, have for a long time, but because of circumstances we'll talk about, that was lifted up because there was pine beetle and spruce beetle and a number of other things that happened that required to deal with those particular volumes that were destroyed by it or died by it and were harvested at one as high as to 80 or 90 million cubic meters.
Which was never harvested, it was paper wood. But
correct. And then from there and then we want to where we are now, probably just a bit south of 40 million cubic meters annually in that general area.
Yeah, way too low.
As a result of that, we had lumber manufacturing capacity throughout the province, the coast, and the interior, but in particular speaking about the interior, nearly 35, 40 sawmills have been shut down because the capacity of fiber was not sufficient to feed the mills, and a number of pulp mills were affected by it, a number of pellet plants were affected by it, and a number of value-added manufacturers, which means that companies that do not only manufacture lumber, they go beyond that and add more social and economic value to the resource. And so that's kind of what it looks like in BC right now. And the objective of my view was that, having been in the industry, I came here in 1965, nearly 60 years. I have a background in the forest industry in Europe. In particular, I was involved in Holland, worked for one of the larger importers of lumber in Holland. My dad managed a small lumber company, and I spent time in Sweden in the forest industry, Central Europe, before I came to Prince George. Here, my dream was always, I was born in 1940, just when the war started. We were liberated by the Canadian Army, April the 12th, 1945. And I always knew from that point forward I would go to Canada, the land of my heroes. And I did when I was 24.
My grandpa was one of those heroes. So.
Was the and so when I came here, I had exactly
$25.47.
But what I did have is attitude, passion, work ethic. Attitude, avoid the negative, find your passion. I did, forest industry, lumber. Work attitude, well, which I did, and I worked hard, but follows is success.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that in all being said, when I came here in 1965, the industry, in particular Prince George, was booming. It was a boom town, pretty rough town. And usually what would happen if you walk, especially on George Street, the question would usually be, when did you get here and when are you leaving?
Yeah. Well, the population of Prince George went from 15,000, 20,000 in 64 to 80,000 in the early 70s, right?
Correct, now, right? So, and then obviously...
Now we're going up again, though, so...
It will. And now what we have is, we have beautiful underlying infrastructure. We got a university, we got a college. The University of Northern British Columbia was started with about 30 years ago. I was very involved in that, and many other people were. Same with the college. And the University of Northern British Columbia is the highest rated small university in Canada, several years already in a row.
It's a great little school.
Amazing, and you know it from yourself because you studied there. So that then being said, relatively speaking to the rest of the world, our forest industry here in the region really started in earnest around 1940-45.
Yeah, I mean, it started when the railway came through. We started making ties and bridges.
In the early 60s, the PG railroad came through. CN was always here. And, you know, before that, and then...
Until we built the pulp mill, though, it was pretty dispersed. There's 300 sawmills between here and McBride, right? And people burned their slabs in the backyard. And
that was all normal practice.
Hand-piled their lumber back on the rail car, right? So,
yeah, that's usually the way it worked, right? And, you know, so... but then, you know, when the PG... They called it PGE, Prince George at last. It was then called the BCR, and now it's part of... the CN. So that's kind of, and it brought then in a lot of investments in the primary manufacturing, but they followed really the investments in the pulp mills, and the two pulp mills in particular, Intercontinental and Prince George Pulp. Investments were made by English companies and some other international companies, including Canfor, that then became the driver behind all forest policy. Usually was policy. And policy developed then was that if you had timber that was crown timber, then there was a process protocol that said that you had to utilize all of the timber and all of the tree, close utilization, so that the pulp mills would receive.
The other problem with that policy, like to go back to the cause of our problems, industry in transition, is that it was very coniferous driven. And if you go back to the, you know, for example, we'll go right back to 1915. The first moose shot in Prince George was in 1915, the same year the railway came through.
Right.
And that was the exact same time we started doing some harvesting along this railway line as it goes back through the Robson Valley. And the moose followed that railway line. People talk about, they followed the fires in. That's a bunch of bunk, because there was fires here for the last 10,000 years, but what there wasn't is there wasn't selective logging.
Right.
And when you do selective logging along the highway, you get those deciduous, or along the railway, you get those deciduous understories coming up.
Right.
The moose come down off the top of the mountain, out in the mountains, and they came right into Prince George. The first moose shot in Williams Lake was in 1916, and it was a First Nations fellow. He had to ask the chief if it was safe to eat. So the moose followed the logging. We didn't have a lot of fires back then. In the 70s, we said, intermediate utilization doesn't work. We can't just go out and high grade. They said, high grade, we got to protect the future timber supply. So we switched to a clear cut model kind of in the 80s, late 70s, the Bower and clear cut. And there's some technological shifts that came in there. And to segue into that, that's when that feller buncher came in. And I'm just going to back up and answer the question about Freya Logging. We're really lucky. We work for Carrier Lumber mostly. We also work for Lakeland. They're both locally owned companies. We love to ship pulp logs to Canfor, but we don't work for Canfor right now, other than to ship them pulp logs. The best part about that is that we're working for locally owned companies, and Canfor is at a bit of an odds with the provincial government right now. Some of those policymakers, there's some old some old anxiety between the NDP and Canfor, and I think we're all paying for that. But Freya delivers about 30 loads a day, and we do about 0.5% of the province's wood. At 40 million, we'd actually do closer to 1%. We're about 350,000 cubic meters a year.
Right.
There's about 55 people that work for us, and we have about 27 pieces of equipment.
Right.
I've sold some of my shares, so I'm a minority shareholder now, and I'm working more on the ideas of these things.
Right.
But Freya is very much about that transition, and I think technology drives things fast. Like, how do you put your finger joints together? With technology. Right. What drove the consolidation of all those small forest licenses? Pulp mill. Had to get chips to the pulp mill. And then Canfor, you know, started buying up all those little licenses around here. So you got bigger and bigger and bigger licenses until you had something approaching a monopoly, which is part of the issues that we're driving today, right?
It is.
You know?
It is not approaching it. Yeah. It is.
It's a problem, right?
Yeah. So so in the 50s in that area, there were around the Prince George area about 600 sawmills. Yeah. And all of them were little small mills that would go to the timber.
Family owned.
Family owned, small entrepreneurial. And they would then cut their timber and have the lumber, the rough lumber, put it on the truck and haul it to Plainer Road, which is now River Road. Yeah, the only one that's on River Road, other than Lakeland, is myself. With
hand stacked, by the way.
And who?
They put them on by hand.
Oh yeah, well yeah, I did it myself. I piled lumber when I first came here. And it was tough jobs. Yeah. So that's what they did. But then close utilization was mandated because they were trying to attract pulp investors,
the big money.
In order to them to commit to investing, they wanted two things. Special forest licenses, which they did acquire, and then and law really policy that meant that if you cut timber, you were obligated to have chippers in the barcus.
Yeah, you had to deliver something to that. You can't just pile your slabs up and burn it, right?
And you cannot deliver chips that have bark in them. Exactly. So all of a sudden, the little mills that were sitting there needed to invest in debarkers and chippers, which would cost 10, 50, was physically impossible because the power was not there. Right?
I have a little bandsaw. I tried to make a living with it when I was just out of school. I was sawing different things. You can't do it. It's just impossible.
No, it does not work.
You need millions of dollars in investment just to get started.
So that's kind of what happened. And then from there on in, you know, most of the mills then were mostly sold out because they could not possibly do that. So the timber was acquired into tenure, and again, we are uniquely different here from other areas, maybe the United States or Sweden. It's, the timber in the province of British Columbia basically belongs to you and me, the people.
95% Crown ownership.
Yeah, and then there are tenure allocations that likely now, I would say in the interior of the province, probably 80% of all the timber is controlled by
West Fraser and Canfor.
Four or five companies.
Mostly West Fraser and Canfor up here, though. Right?
Yeah, so. And then add to that Tulco, Interfor to a certain extent, and most of them have decided to invest right now
elsewhere.
Elsewhere means in the United States,
well,
primarily.
It rains a lot in Georgia and Alabama, and a radiata pine tree grows in 20 years, and people work for $15 an hour. But that's changing because, the landowners down there, they want to get a few more bucks for their wood than they did a few years ago. You've got environmental groups that are giving those landowners carbon offsets to delay their harvest. Yeah. And you also have other issues down there, bugs and forest fires, and even a lot of the landowners in the United States, they're not driven by timber production. A lot of them are driven by white-tailed deer production. They want to shoot big bucks. They're going to manage their property for biodiversity, not for wood, because wood doesn't pay the bills. People pay $20,000 to shoot a big white-tailed buck.
Exactly. That's and that's other values that are coming from it.
Value added on the landscape. You do value added. You take some trim ends and you put them together. Yeah. My thought when I got into the forest industry here was there was a lot of leftover waste. And when you looked at those trim ends going into the chipper or going into the beehive burner, what I saw is I saw forests that weren't being fully utilized in our province. And I'm a moose hunter. First thing I ever ate was moose meat when I was 7 months old. It was off a selective cut in McBride in 1979. My dad went and climbed the mountain up there, and everyone said he was crazy, but he finally found a friend to go and pack the moose off the mountain. And the first thing my kid ever ate when he was 6 months old was moose meat that I shot in a selective cut at the bottom of the valley. I got in an argument with my dad about calling out with a quad, and we finally settled and boned it out and packed it out because it was just a few kilometers. But selective logging in my life has been a driving factor in my satisfaction because it's where the best hunting is. And you know, hunting drives a lot of people. First Nations, myself, a lot of people. There's 10,000 moose hunters in Prince George. When you stop selective logging, the moose population hung in for a bit because you know what moose eat in the winter? They eat balsam, and balsam grows in the understory. But it only grows in the understory if there's a bit of light shining through. When we get these very dense coniferous stands, it's just pine needles and moss. And if we don't open them up a little bit, they stay like that. Super high fire hazard, very low biodiversity. So lots of smoke and no moose. And here we are today. I can't even see Cranbrook. It's 3 kilometers over there, and it's just
and it may get worse.
It's getting worse. So what we need to do is we need to adopt some kind of a Scandinavian model. And you know how I was talking earlier how in 1915 we shot the first moose in Prince George? So my father-in-law from Sweden, he's still alive, he was a log driver in the 50s and the 60s. So they used to flood the creeks in Scandinavia and run them down the rivers to the mouths on the Baltic. That's where the big sawmills were. So he'd have been running it to Umeå. But he said there's no moose when he was a kid. Well, there's some, but it was a big deal. If you got a moose, that was something they talked about for a long time. If you look at the statistics, Sweden shot maybe 10,000 moose in the 50s. By 1984, they shot 170,000 moose. Today, they shoot 100,000 moose. Today, BC, which is 2.5 times bigger, shoots 10,000 moose. So if we were the same size as Sweden by a per square kilometer basis, Sweden would shoot 250,000 moose. To our 10,000 moose. A couple other good statistics. Our annual allowable cut, under 50 million now. Sweden's cut.
Under 40.
90 million in Sweden on 40% of the land base. I can tell you, when you walk in Sweden, the boulders are as big as this coffee table and this couch. There's a bit of moss, and there's a little tree trying to grow its life out of there. Forest fires, we're doing 400,000 hectares of forest fires. Sweden's averaging 2,500. It's an order of magnitude and a half lower. So they're shooting an order of magnitude more moose on a much smaller land base, and they're burning 2% of the hectares that we are. And you know what? I met there's a great machine company called Ponsse. They make in Finland. They make the wheeled harvesters and porters. I met the CEO last month, and I said, "Why does Sweden have so few forest fires?" And he looked at me and said, "Sweden burns 2,500 hectares." And I said, "Yeah, it's crazy low." He says, "Finland does 800." Now Finland's 2/3 the size of Sweden. So we can have less fires, more timber, and more biodiversity if we change how we manage. And the way to do that is simple. We just have to reduce the density of the forest, get some deciduous coming up in the understory, and allow deciduous in the overstory.
So 40, 50 years ago, when I was still in Holland, Sweden had the same problem as we are having today. They had too much capacity, not enough timber. And they had problems in the marketplace. Marketplace went up and down and all the same.
It always will.
So then what happened? They changed. And although the ownership structure, as you know, in Sweden of the forest is maybe 10 to 15% or crown, the rest is all private, directly, indirectly.
Sveaskog is a crown corporation though, right? They're about half of Sweden is actually crown owned, but it's run by a crown corporation, so it's kind of private.
So but managed private. You know, so then what they did is they started intensive forestry. And then they went from what virtually was like us in the area of going down to as low as 50, and it gradually increased to where today is around 90 million cubic meters. And they have not enough capacity, meaning manufacturing capacity. And they have markets all over the world. And they are doing very, very well. So, but we are not reinventing the wheel here.
No, we're just doing something simple.
But what has happened here, we are a land of plenty. So what happened when I came here in 1965, from my experience in Holland, you know, where I worked for, as I said, one of the biggest importers of Western Europe, and we were doing, I was part of an auditing team. They had 35 smaller companies that did a lot of remanufacturing and value-added manufacturing, preparing, making lumber for windows and doors and all the other kind of things. And the first thing that I came to Prince George was my 2547. Couldn't speak the language, didn't know a soul, didn't have a job. And then got a job as a cleanup man. And the first thing that I looked at a mill, I could not believe what went up the burner chain. It was unbelievable. The same, not quite to the same extent, is still somewhat the same today. And then it was not until probably mid to late 60s, early 70s, lodgepole pine
was weed.
Was a weed because it was too small. They wanted something like this, right? And so we are still in that transition, Liam. From that, and I'm writing a book, and I wrote. Did you see any of my books?
I've started on ADHD Unlocked. It was at somebody's house. But do you know what I think about Canada? There's money oozing out of every crack in Canada. We have way too much. We have a disease of too much. We're indolent. We're negatively minded because, you know what? If the wood's this big, it's not big enough. I want wood this big. The solution is to find. The solution is not to find bigger wood. The solution is to work with what's in front of you and have a positive attitude.
So what happens to me when in 1975, let me tell you this first. You know, I came here, couldn't speak the language, didn't know a soul, didn't have a job. So I started out with nothing, slept outside in a little old building, then got a job as cleanup man, then was promoted, I call, to piling on the green chain, piled rough lumber for export, 18 to 24, 10-inch rough lumber dipped in PCB. You know, so I was soaking wet from top to bottom. PCB. 9 months until I was recognized as saying, this guy got potential. So within a year and a half, I was a superintendent. That didn't go fast enough for me. So then there was an opportunity. Somebody came to me and said, I want to hire you. I have a small mill and I want you to become the general manager and I'll give you 1/3 ownership if you want to do that for 5 years. I did that. Where was the sawmill? Watson Lake, Yukon.
Oh, nice.
Have you been in Watson Lake?
I was there last week.
Okay, well, there you go. And
there's a lot of pine up there. There's a lot of green pine up there.
I know that. And in any event, so I was there for 5 years. And then I gave it all away for $1. It's all in the book. And then I came back here. And then worked again for one of the bigger mills here. And then in 1975, I did a business plan and started Brink Forest Products. The point that I was going to make is that I didn't have any money. I had lots of ideas. I laid awake at nights, and then my experience in Holland. I was not overly successful in school. You know, I failed grade 3. No, don't know anybody. And I failed grade 7 3 times. And then I got a job as a furniture maker. And then when I came here, my dream was to build my own lumber mill. And I incorporated a company, Brink Forest Products, in 1975. But I had to find a way because I didn't have any money. And somehow I got money from one of the banks, $25,000 to start a lumber company. And then, okay, so what am I going to do? Well, I found that because of my experience in Holland, and looking at the opportunities here, I couldn't afford to buy timber or a sawmill, but I knew one thing. I had exposure to laminating. Nobody was doing that here.
As a furniture builder.
Exactly. And then from there on in, I started the first finger joint plant in Canada in 1975. Where did I find it, that finger jointer? Looked all over the place, and I found this finger jointer that I thought would work for my purposes in Marvin Windows in Warroad, Minnesota. And so where is Warroad, Minnesota? Well, if you fly into Winnipeg, then get a car, go across the border, then you will go to Warroad, and then
the Scandinavian part of America.
And then if you go too far, that's where you go over the end. That's the end of the world,
right?
You know. And then I asked them, saying, "Okay, I'm here for the finger joint. Big plant, actually. He's still around. I don't know if he's still there. It could well be." So I said, "Well, where is the finger joint?" He said, "It's there somewhere. You have to go find it." So I found it, sent it to Prince George. That's what started my company. The point is the one that you were making, is that if you are entrepreneurial and you don't have the land of plenty, then I lay awake in the middle of the night because tomorrow morning I'm going to have to explain to the banker as to why am I doing what I'm doing, and that has to work.
And when you get too comfortable, you stop innovating, right?
And that's the whole idea.
Do you know the old Birchie sawmill on East Shelley Road there? There's an old sawmill out there.
Yeah, I think I know, but I don't know the actual mill.
That's how Freya got started. I was a salesman at Wajax, and I was working with another guy, friend of mine, and we bought that property, and I wanted to log it the Swedish way. And we tried to hire some logging companies in this town, and no one would come log. It was in 20,000 meters of nice wood right beside town. It was busy times in 2016, so I said, well, so I had $10,000. I went to the bank and got a loan for one forwarder.
Right.
And we put it out there, and we hired some subcontractors, and they all fell down in front of us. So we ended up having to buy. It was like the lady that swallowed the fly, and then she swallowed the spider, and then she swallowed the bird. We bought a forwarder, then we needed a harvester, then we needed a log loader, then we needed 2 forwarders, then we needed 2 harvesters.
Right.
And it was just bang, bang, bang. So we started with nothing, but by the time we were finished that job at Birchie's, Andre from Lakeland had come and asked us to come and do some blowdown pine. It had been killed in the 2006, 2007. And the bunchers, they have a real hard time with that broke up pine. When it falls over, it smashes to pieces, where a harvester it's got a light touch, picks it up, runs it through. You get much higher, your cut to cruise goes up, as well as your overall, like if you're going to do a block, it costs money to lay it out, it costs money to build the road. So if you get 2/3 of the volume out of it with the buncher that you will with a harvester and a forwarder. And if you look at that as an anecdote for our entire forest industry, we're so wasteful. But you know what the best news is we're so wasteful and we're so far behind that we can fix these problems very easily. We're at the low plateau, and we can exponentially increase the amount of work. We can exponentially decrease the amount of smoke, and exponentially increase the amount of good feelings we have about our forest with some fairly small changes. It's not complicated. It's just good attitude. And you talk about attitude. The forest industry in this province for the last 15 years has been extremely negative, and it has to change. It's a pendulum. It went way too far, and now it's ashes, right? You know, the cuts 40 million people. Just you talk to people, nobody's positive. It's like, man, if I was a kid today, go be a logger. The future is going to be stopping the smoke, right? You know, the RPF Association just released a study. If we don't address forest fire hazard at the landscape level in British Columbia, it could cost us $20 billion a year. And you want to talk about climate change? You want to talk about carbon dioxide? Look out that window. Every cubic meter of wood that burns up today is putting 830 kilograms of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Right.
And if you think about the forest, there's trees, but there's also branches, but there's also all the duff, the carbon, and the moss and the litter layer.
Right.
So every hectare you burn, you know, it's a little bit of a range, because you can have a dry pine stand or you can have a real dense spruce stand. You could have 300-400 tons of carbon dioxide going up in smoke immediately. But those trees, they don't disappear. They stay there, but they're rotting back. So all your new growth has got to fight all that old carbon dioxide that's rotting off of that fire over that time frame. So if we can stop forest fires, we can fight climate change. And while we do that, we're also making that forest more biodiverse. We're also making it's just going to give us more moose meat in our freezer, and nicer walks, and more blueberries, and more birds, and get those ecosystem services back. So,
but be a long way away from that.
I don't think so. My company was doing, we started off doing not a lot of volume, and we were maybe 2% selective our first year. We're 100% selective right now. So right now we're at Valemont Community Forest. We're in a block that was logged in 75. We're getting up to 12-inch wood off of it. We're just taking out about, a third of the volume. We're also carrier licensed in Valemont. It's in a visual quality objective, so they can't log it because it'll destroy the view unless you do it in a certain way. We're taking lots of wood off that hill, and you can barely tell we're there. You go back a couple of years later, the forest floor is greened up, fire hazards down, and there's moose pellets everywhere. We've been out at the Willow River demonstration forest logging. Were you here when the burn happened here?
Yeah.
The Grove burn, the big one?
Yeah.
We're logging it.
Yeah.
Right? In your lifetime, we're logging it. And there's trees that I planted in the 90s that I bet that we could thin in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
So
actually, a good example as well, Liam, is that the Barron River, I had a sawmill right in the middle of it.
Yep.
In the early 80s.
Yep.
That was spruce beetle, obviously. Yep. Spruce has a tendency, it doesn't stay viable as for an economic utilization as long as pine does.
Not even close.
You know, and but that whole area was virtually cleared off.
The biggest clear cut in the world.
and at that point, right, where it was far succeeded by that, obviously, with the pine clear cut, you know, by volume. But if you today, and you probably have been there, go through the Barron region, it is amazing what has happened to it. And so my point is, I'm not saying that it will not be done or is not possible. I know
we're doing it right now,
and I've been saying that over and over and over again all along, because I've seen it in Sweden, I've seen it in other places, but there are a number of issues and a number of problems.
No, there's no issues and there's no problems.
Okay, let me tell you some of them.
You told me attitude, ignore the negative.
Yeah, no, but here we talking as friends and saying, okay, we've been there. So what is happening here was the land of plenty. That's the one problem.
Here's how to fix that. Justin Trudeau has got our doors open. He opened the doors for immigration. Then he got a bulldozer and he pushed over a wall. Then he put some dynamite under the other wall. So we have like 2 walls up right now. So our company's running probably 2/3 to 3/4 immigrants. And they're coming here, they're coming from the UK, they're coming from Sweden, they're coming from Germany, come from Switzerland. They come here, they got a fresh attitude. They've been trained in a school for 4 years on how to run the equipment that we're running. They believe in it. And you know what? When you tell them half-ton pickup, they see Ford F-150, Chevy, half-ton. Their eyes get as big as saucer plates. They're in love. And this landscape,
they love it,
they buy a fishing license for $38 and they can fish all of Germany, Sweden, and Finland, the same area. In Sweden, it's $100 to fish a lake. You know, for 1 year. And some lakes, it's $100 a day to fish one lake. There's so much opportunity in Canada. Anybody wants to come here and apply themselves, it's going to do extremely well. And I'll give Justin credit for that. Like, immigration has always driven our country, and
it is.
You know, it's really important to look at the original immigrants here too, right? You know, the first people that came to this land, they had a managerial ethic about it, that they could live off the land on the food. We need to get back to managing the landscape around us for food. We can't just make 2x4s. We need to have blueberries. We need to have mushrooms. We need to have good places to go for walks. And honestly, moose meat and bear meat and elk meat, all those things, we can get that value added off the landscape. We just have to tweak our management a little bit. Not a lot, just a little bit.
And that's exactly what it is, right? So we see that now with the allocation of fiber to First Nations,
big time.
who will not just use it for knocking it down and sending it to a mill to make 2x4s, but are looking for other values.
I got to ask you a personal question. You were in the 60s, right?
Pardon me?
You were here in the 60s, right?
I am in my...
You were in Prince George in the 60s. When did you move here, 62?
Yeah, 65.
65. I have a vision of Prince George, and I wasn't alive. I was born in 79. You had many, many, many forest licenses. And I have a vision of Prince George, and it's a lot of wealthy people. And I see pictures of Jake's Steakhouse, and I see downtown Prince George, and it's a lot of fancy cars for the time. People dressed up nice. Jack Boudreau's books, you read about people had a party, but there was a sense of wealth. And we had a landscape, and we had money, and we had licenses. And if I cut the logs in the wintertime and I sawed them up in the summer on my head rig and packed them down to the planer mill, I put that wealth into many people's hands at the local level. And in the 70s, what did we got? We got those pulp mills. We got a switch. And it's like, give up your job where you got to get up in the morning and say, geez, if I don't get my wood in this winter, it's going to be break up in 3 weeks and it's going to melt. I'm not going to get my logs in front of my sawmill. I'm going to sit around all summer long and maybe have to give my land back to the bank. I got to go. And we traded that for a unionized job at the pulp mill where we could do anything. We could swear and cuss and show up to work asleep and do whatever because it was easy. But I think that was really bad for the culture of Prince George. I really feel like we gave up our soul when we traded big monopolies of wood. And we need to get back to that point where we're distributing wealth in the north particularly. And you know, like you talk about First Nation licenses, when you give a First Nations license out, that wealth stays in Prince George. And that's really what we need if we're going to build this community. We can't just ship profits off to Vancouver and going back to policy on the forestry. A lot of our forestry policy is conifer centric. It's grow, pine, stumpage. I've had conversations with the Ministry of Forests here. They don't want to take out some of the trees now because, you know, in 20 years there'll be a huge amount of timber here and we can get more stumpage. It's like, well, what good does he do if it's black and crispy, right? These plantations, they're not fireproof. Right. These forests burned every 30 to 70 years before we came along and started putting out the fires. And guess what? You add a couple degrees of temperature increase, and Prince George is actually getting warmer quicker than the global average because we're a continental climate. It doesn't take very many extra degrees of heat to get that fire going real fast. And these plantations, they got branches all the way down to the ground. Right. There's no sunlight on the forest floor. The blueberries are gone, all those deciduous shrubs, which is really where your biodiversity is. There's three deciduous species in the overstory here. There's birch, there's aspen, and there's cottonwood. There's 100 in the understory at least. You know, the red willows and the willows, and there's just, I can name them all off, but it takes too long. Right. That's where your biodiversity is coming from. That's where the bees are floating around. That's where the birds are flying. Right. They don't like pine. Nothing eats pine. Yeah. And I'm going to take a little segue here. This is an interesting theory, so attention deficit disorder. So if we look back prior to, you're a bit familiar with the Yukon. So you know the north part of the Yukon never had glaciers, right? Right. So they can go back on the benthic layer of the lakes. I don't know if you know what that is. So every year the pollen sits on the lake, sits down, and you can read that like a book. You just read those layers, right?
The whole history is all there.
All of British Columbia was under mile ice, right?
Exactly, yeah.
People worry about biodiversity in Prince George. I'm like, for 100,000 years, the biodiversity here was zero. It was ice, right? And imagine the soil compaction of a mile of ice pushing down on that till down there, right? So exactly. We're in a young landscape. Prince George is cool because the Engelmann spruce met the white spruce here from the Yukon Reserve. We have these hybridized species, but they dug into the northern Yukon lakes and they looked at 2.5 million years of forest cover. Right. For 490 million years. So everything in the last, except for 10,000 years, you had an open spruce forest with quite a bit of balsam and almost no fires. Right. For 10,000 years, there was 1% pine in the Yukon for 2.5 million years. Now it's like 40% pine. Right. And the fire frequency is way up. Yeah. Guess what else happened 10,000 years ago? We lost 77% of all the mammals in North America went extinct within 2,000 years of sort of this period where man had showed up before that, but obviously man got pretty efficient at hunting for a while. Right. And the creature that I'm picking on is the mastodon, which is like the mammoth, but he's a big, woolly elephant, and his teeth look like buncher teeth. If I showed you his teeth, you'd be like, that's a buncher tooth. Yeah. And when you find mastodon poop, it's 60% pine needles and spruce needles. What eats pine needles and spruce needles today? Right. Nothing. No. So you could have had 10 million of these things. I mean, there's a landslide in Colorado 40,000 years ago. They found 22 mammoths buried in it. The biggest mammoth in that herd was 10,000 kilograms. Right. Can you imagine how many pine needles and spruce needles a 10,000 kilogram is 22,000 pounds? Lots. Would have to eat. So this herd of mastodons would have gone through and it would have eaten just like
cleared of the whole countryside.
And if you think about it, in the forest, there's terpenes and tannins, and there's a real smart guy in this town, Jeff Werner. You should have him on your podcast. He was the first guy that brought this to my attention. But
who's the guy?
Jeff Werner. He's a biologist. Oh, yeah. And he had groundbreaking research that showed that brush that grows in full sunlight, if a moose eats it, its belly gets full, but it's starving because there's too much tannins and terpenes. And it's just like the tip of a carrot and the top of a carrot. The part of the carrot that sticks out of the ground, you don't want to eat that because it's too bitter, but the tip's real good. I was actually eating willow tips the other day. They're pretty good, but you can't eat last year's growth, right? And so the mastodon herd would have eaten the lower terpene and tannin needles, which would have been the suppressed and intermediate trees. So the trees in the understory don't get as much sunshine, so they can't protect themselves. Right. So that herd would have thinned from below and left the bigger trees. So we had big trees, and then you can imagine spruce needles and pine needles don't do much for the soil, right? They kind of sit there. There's a whole bunch of fungal activity going on, but there's not much plants and bacteria. So now you're turning it into poop. Right. So actually elephant poop is 2% nitrogen. Right. So you can imagine how many kilograms of nitrogen we were putting onto each and every hectare in Canada for 2.5 million years. Right. And this architect of the landscape. And it wasn't just them. There was ground sloths. Do you know what a ground sloth is?
No.
Do you know what a sloth is? It's that silly creature that sleeps a lot and eats in the trees.
I've probably seen a picture of it.
It looks like a koala bear, kind of.
Yeah, yeah.
There was ground sloths in this is more Central America. They were 7,000 kilograms. And all they ate was trees because they had big dentition and they find their poop and it's full of needles. So we had this massive animal megafauna that thinned our forests for us. And that all ended. They all died. You can blame it on humans. You can blame it on climate change.
Yeah.
But our forests are not evolved for this because it takes millions and millions of years for evolution to find ecological niches. And this is a 10,000-year-old ecosystem.
Right.
Nature isn't nature and it's not natural. And we started playing with it and we can't stop.
Right. And that's what it is.
That's what I think. That's why I think the moose population exploded in Sweden. Because in the 70s, they changed their technology to selective logging, thinning. And when they started thinning, they opened up the forest and those animals could come in. The moose population went crazy, right?
So where do we go then from here as we kind of look at the landscape now, economic one, that, there you have this absolutely amazing province, British Columbia.
Growing wood like crazy.
Not today, but, but still in one of the most beautiful places in the world. I look around the world, I've been all over the world, look at Europe, the war in the Ukraine and all the other things that are happening there. A lot of people just like anthills, and I'm here in BC and it is paradise. And the problem that I have with it is points somewhat towards yours, looking at the forest industry, but the other part that I look at is that saying that in terms of the economic distribution of the wealth of British Columbia, 80% of the GDP, the gross domestic product of the province of British Columbia, comes from northern British Columbia, north of Hope.
Really?
So I say to my fellas down south, send some of it, more of it,
some back.
down here, right? Because
cheap.
then we can do some of these other things. Like I like to have a school here. I've been working on it for years already. I've been quite involved with the College of New Caledonia. You know, my name is on it. The John A. Brink Trades and Vocational School, and then the but I want to see a technology center, no different than, not the same size. BCIT is about 40,000 students. I want to see something here that is for the north, because if we train them here, for the trades in particular, they will stay here, in most cases. And we have to make that investment, because if we want to attract investment here, then it is not location, it is not the and I'm not only talking about
we're short of people, right? We're short of people. That's always been the issue in British Columbia.
It's not the roads, it's not the air, it's not the transportation. Our location globally for
products, all except for people.
Access to skill sets. That's what we need.
And specific skill sets. So where Europe exceeds, where we absolutely catastrophically fail, is our education system is created by teachers to produce teachers. They get a bachelor's degree in something and they become a teacher. And the problem is the medium is the message. So if you're a teacher, you went to school, then you went to university, then you went to education school, you came back, you're creating the exact same thing. In Europe, they don't do that. When you're 16, if you're a bored boy in a classroom, or if you're a bored girl, whatever, you want to go run a machine, you go into a trade, and they teach you about hydraulic cylinders, and they teach you about the forest, and they teach you about basic soil, and they teach you about how an engine works, and they teach you about basic math that actually works. And you create an individual that has skills that can now go out and do things.
Okay, here comes a surprise for you. I'm ADHD.
Well, we both are, so that's
good. I was gonna, but that's what you will find interesting, because it took me until, obviously I failed in school because I didn't even know I was there. Grade 3 times grade 7. I thought that I was a failure, and so I had to start all over again.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. Okay, well then you can relate to that. And so when I came here in 1965, you know, I was only 35 years old, and I started my mill, and everybody said, "Oh, you're so successful." I didn't feel that way.
No,
you know,
I still don't. You know,
Yeah.
I built up something. I had great partners, but you know, like I built that up. I still feel every day I got to go out and do something else to make the world better, because you're never finished.
Exactly.
You're never finished.
I say ADHD is a superpower.
I agree with you.
I could not have done what I've done and still do today. Build the company. I'm not bragging here, 10 or 12 different companies. In addition to that, I write books, amazingly. I was born in Holland, you know, and Dutch is a difficult language, but I grew up in the extreme northeastern part of Holland. They speak a dialect. They can't even understand me in the rest of Holland if I speak. I grew up speaking dialect, so I had to come from my crazy dialect in the northeast to trying to speak High Dutch, which never worked all that well for me. Until I was 24, I had to learn to speak English. And you know, so I'm doing okay right now. But in any event, it was grade 7. I wrote 3 books. I'm writing another one, is Living Young, Dying Old, and this one you will like. I'm writing a book on the forest industry that is 100 years of forest industry in British Columbia. It's going to be a very good one. Comes out next September.
Right on.
The other one, Dying Young.
That sounds good. Yeah.
You like it?
That one.
Yeah. So in any event, this one, so I walked into a store here and opened a book in a bookstore, and I looked at it. Driven to Distraction was the name, and I looked at it and I talked about ADHD, and I said, "Oh my God, that's me."
But is it, you know, one of the things that I see with ADHD is that, you know, education didn't exist really until about 1870, right? Before that, you went to Sunday school if you're not in the Lord class, and if you're in the Lord class, you went to a public school in England. You know, as the equivalent of a private school today, and you know, you got a university, but that was like maybe 10% of the population. 90% of the population learned how to sew oats, or if their dad made shoes, they learned to make shoes. And we changed to this factory model in about that time period when we brought in education. A lot of what education actually was just teaching you to focus on one thing. You're in the cotton gin mill, and you got to do one thing. You got to assemble this one bolt on this one car. You know, if you look 5 years in the future, the way that AI, like, you know, you go to the Carrier sawmill now, no one touches a log. There's scanners. They look at the log, it comes through, they decide what they're going to create, what they're going to give to you, the trim ends. And then it comes out, gets wrapped, stamped, done. What are we going to do in the future? Yeah.
So what happened to me, let me tell you this, you can relate to this. So that was the thing about the book. And then I bought the book. I was standing there looking at it. I don't do many books actually, but then the guy that owned the store said, "Gonna buy it or what?" You know. So obviously, you know. So then I bought the book and wrote in Dutch. Now I finally know who I am. But you know what really changed me from feeling confident that I could interact with others for a long time, even already when I had the mill, a number of other companies, and everybody said, "Oh, you're so successful," and blah, blah. I didn't feel that way.
No.
And so
successful people never do.
and then what happened to me, in 1990, I was 50 years old, and my ex-sister-in-law dragged me down. I don't know, still don't know why. I was not going to go there. She said, "I want you to go to Toastmasters." Have you heard of Toastmasters?
Yeah.
Okay, let me...
Public speaking.
Yeah, let me... It's not only public speaking, it's listening. You know, so as well, and thinking on your feet. But anyway, let me tell you about that. So I said, "What are they going to do there?" He said, I said, "If somebody's going to ask me questions, I don't want to go." They said, no, they're not going to ask you anything. So I went down there, and I sat down and I listened halfway through it, and he said, "Okay, John, tell me about you." And I said, "Oh my God, I never come back here," right? So in any event, I did go back. I stayed there for 10 years, from 1990 until 2000. And then I'm just telling you that because I believe it is interesting that I became a DTM, Distinguished Toastmaster, which is the highest level in Toastmasters. And there are different levels that somebody can use it as much as they feel they need it for. Others stay there longer, and like me, I did that. And changed my life, because what would happen to me is that I had to acquire the skill of sitting back and listening.
Yep.
And I had to acquire the skill of coherently explain what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And all of that I learned or acquired at Toastmasters.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a storyteller. That's my background.
You're good at narrative.
I can do the books, but I'm also a very good speaker.
Yeah.
And I can go and give presentations. I'm a professional speaker, speak in several areas on keynotes and all those other things, where I can precisely remember virtually what I want to speak about for an hour and leave it very coherent, take question and answers.
Yep.
All those skills I acquired through Toastmasters.
Yep.
And I could not have, so the first thing that happened to me is Toastmasters. Then I knew I could acquire the skills to meet with that part, gave me more confidence. I didn't have much before.
Yeah.
And then I saw about ADHD and started looking at it.
Yeah.
And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, so there was, I was 57, and it took me about 5 years before I went to my doc, who was a friend, had delivered my 2 daughters.
Yeah.
And one day I came into his office, he said, "Hey John, why are you here?" I said, "I think I got ADHD." And he said, "Oh my God, let's look at it." So we looked at it together and spent time on it and researching, and he said, "Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
No question about that."
Yeah. But is the solution to medicate you with basically crystal meth? Probably not. So, you know, the medication for ADHD is worse than the disease, I think.
I don't use anything.
Yeah, they look at the CAT scans on people that have been using, especially Adderall. Like it's basically speed. It's a crystal
Adderall,
meth derivative.
Yeah.
And it fires up, it makes you focus for a while, but it's kind of like using like 4600 fertilizer in a field. It just burns it out. And after a while, there's nothing left.
You know something, Liam? So I went down there. Now I understood, right? But the problem that I had is because I was building a lumber company and I'm expanding and growing, and I didn't say much about it when I saw the book. I didn't even go to my doc until 5 years later.
Yeah.
Because what am I going to do? Go to the bank and say I want to do this, but I have one issue. I have a mental problem and it's called ADHD. You say, "Have a nice day," right?
That's right.
Not now, So, but then only 5-6 years ago, I started talking about it more and more and more. And then I wrote a book about it, and you will find this book interesting, because when I wrote the book, the first one that I wrote is this one.
Yeah.
And this one here, Against All Odds, is not about how successful John is.
Yeah.
It is to the contrary. In fact,
How to be successful.
How to fall down in the worst of circumstances, growing up during the last years of the war, when I had no dad because he was lost in the war, and my mom was raising 3 kids. I'm the youngest and trying to get by every day, hundreds of planes overhead, and all of that. So the effect of 2 things: the inner child, I was at consultation for actually, and then the other one was the PTSD that still stays with me always.
Yeah.
And then I find out about ADHD, and then a number of other problems that happened to me. So I wrote the book, a very open book about all of that. And so it's not about hoorah, hoorah, how successful, but it's more an inspiration for others that maybe have challenges or have been there, and they don't think they can do it. If I can do it,
never give up, right?
Never give up.
Yeah. And mistakes are not mistakes; they're just lessons.
They are lessons.
That's it.
And then the other one that I did is obviously this one is finding your passion, living the dream. And with all of that, if somebody says to me, "Okay, John, are you living your dream?" I said, "Absolutely." No question about it, When
I was starting Freya, I went to rental purchase a machine because I couldn't buy a machine because we weren't bankable yet. And I went to rental purchase a machine from a dealership in town, and they said, "Yeah, we're not going to do that because you won't make it."
Oh no. I had the same, you know, that when I started my company, the first, with my $25,000, this is one for you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
With my $25,000, you know, they asked one of the fellows, I'm not going to name his name, but he's dead now anyway, but you know, he said, nah, don't invest in him.
Never going to make it.
He's never going to make it, you know.
I love to hear that, though, because, you know, when I went into equipment sales, I wanted to sell the machines that they were running in Europe. And I was told they don't work here. We tried that. It doesn't work. And there was 100 reasons. There's 100 reasons why it doesn't work. And a few people tried to run those equipment here, but we just never quite took off. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do this, and we're not going to have any other type of equipment. We're just going to have this equipment. You're not going to get to ease out to the buncher or go to the skidder. It's harvesters, it's forwarders, and we made it work with $10,000 and 100-hour weeks, and you know,
all in the mind.
I gotta say, I really appreciate that my wife didn't leave me during that period. So.
Well, that's another thing. I've been lucky, you know, that you know, she stayed with me, and you know, through all the ups and downs. You know, so and I'll give you this one as well.
Awesome.
And then this one in particular, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it. Is that so? I wrote this book because I felt it was so important to talk about it more and more because of the stigma. And even this morning I had a podcast that we did with a lady out of Miami. Also, she does a lot of activity with ADHD, although most of my podcasts are not about that. They are about a whole lot. You're number 140, actually, my podcast.
Yep, nice, perfect.
Yeah, and so what I did was this one. I had to write about it, and then I said, okay, I tell about it, and you will find it interesting because the one that writes the foreword is a lady by the name of Tracy Lotz. She's a medical doctor and an emergency surgeon.
Yep.
ADHD.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, and so I have those stories in it, and then about my own, and then when I had it finished, I said, something is missing here. Because okay, you wrote about that, you talked about that in your book and all the other things. Now what? And the now what was missing. So I met this fellow, and I'm referring to the one. His name is Dr. Tom Romer, and he's the Vice President Academics for the British Columbia Institute of Technology.
Yep.
I met him in the plane. I'm sitting on 3A, and he was sitting next to me, and he said, I remember you from last year, you know, that, do you remember me? I said, kind of, which meant no, you know, and so we talked, and he said, you talked about writing a book, the other one, and I said, yeah, it's all done, and I said, but I'm doing another one, and the one that I'm doing, ADHD Unlocked, and he said, oh, that's interesting, because we are doing things about ADHD, and we're looking at studying and what you do about blah, 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 all that kind of stuff comes to the issue that you raised. And then the more I thought about it, the following week again, I was sitting on 4A, and he was sitting on 1F, and the plane was full, and I saw him. I said, Tom, wait for me, don't go on, I need to talk to you. And I said to him, let's talk more about ADHD and what you're doing, because I need, where do we go from here, especially in the schooling system, the training system. And they're working on something called micro-certification. It's focusing on
a skill
that we talked about earlier when you said from Europe, the skill set, so that the student that is not only ADHD, but also the ones that have trauma, for somebody, First Nations comes to mind, other people that have had PTSD or other reason that makes them slow learners.
David Suzuki gave me PTSD when I was growing up.
Okay.
He made me worry about the world. I had eco-anxiety, and my solution to that was to go out and make it better.
Exactly. and so that's kind of what I wanted him to write about in my book as an added. The micro-certification is focusing on the main key area, add the other things to it later if you need them, but at least develop the skill sets.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and awesome. I have you this one too.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, sir.
So anything else that comes to, we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I think it was a great conversation. I would just say, I would reiterate that, you know, we're filling our children's head with doom and gloom about the future. And I think that's a bunch of bunk. Environmentalism is true. We need to look after the earth, but we have to be active managers of our forests. We have to go out there and solve the problems. We have big problems. It means we need big solutions to these problems. And I think that right now the forest industry is very much protect it all, environmentalism, stop consuming stuff, and it's essentially the background message is slit your wrists, don't have babies, and we're just going to die. That's absolutely the wrong message. On the industrial side, it's like, everything's fine, what's the problem? Neither of those answers are correct. Now, the good news is whether you're in the Yukon or whether you're in British Columbia, Yukon doesn't really have a forest industry. They have forest fires, they have overdense coniferous forests, never been logged by man, but we did our damage 12,000 years ago. So it's been screwed up for 12,000 years. So it's getting worse in some places, but BC is a beneficiary of climate changes pushing species north. And we're not going to turn into a desert, particularly anytime soon, maybe in a Soyuz for a little bit. Maybe Kurt Garland's wine will get a little bit better down on Winery Road down there in Oliver. But I do think that we need to instill a message of hope in our children. Yes, we have big problems, but big solutions are with us. And the technology is gaining ground so quickly with artificial intelligence and everything else, and our understanding of the natural systems, that we can be an agent for good. We're very powerful as humans. We're not evil. We're not bad. We're not good. It's our choice every day to go out there and make the world a better place for our kids particularly. And I think that if I can just pass that message along, that the kids of today are going to have a great life, and we're going to spend time enjoying nature, because we don't need people to stack the green chain anymore. We won't even need truck drivers in 5 years. So what are we going to do? We're going to fix nature. We're going to make nature more biodiverse. Did you know, John, if you look at the bones in the north, the density of animals per hectare 15,000 years ago was 100 times more. There's 100 times more pounds of meat per acre, or more kilograms of meat per hectare than there is today. We're living in a ghost of an ecosystem as compared to what it was. And I want to be one of the guys that gets everybody moving towards bringing that back. Because nature's cool, but it takes tens of millions of years to evolve things. And when you extinct species, when you extinct whole families in genera, you can't just bring them back. And I think that logging is an excellent way to sort of store carbon, fight climate change, and bring that biodiversity back to landscape if it's done properly. We haven't done that yet, but we're close. So,
Liam,
yeah,
thank you. Nice having you on the show. Yeah. And just for our guests, this again was another session. The 140th actually of having.
We're geniuses now.
I like that. Having a discussion on BC forest industry and transition. The interesting part about Liam is that he approaches this from a different way than a lot of other people would do, in saying, well, what has that got to do is making 2x4s? Obviously, it does a lot, and I agree with Liam that we have a responsibility to those that follow us. We are extremely fortunate being in this environment, with the changes to the forest industry in transition, with more of the land and the timber going back to First Nations that are very concerned about the land, and all the other lives and all the other things that are important to our forest should be considered, and should be more considered as we go forward, in addition to the economic consideration. So it is delightful to hear Liam and his views, which he holds very strongly, obviously. The other part which is interesting, my fellow ADHDer, Liam, is again very passionate, speaking about the things that he believes in. Amazing individual, lots of energy, all those things that are important. I've been able to share with him my books, and I wish him all the best and success. We'll stay in touch.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Ian.
it.
Appreciate it.